Basic beginnings. BASIC, or Beginner's All-Purpose Symbolic Instruction Code, is a general-purpose, high-level programming language that was designed way back in 1964 by Kamili and Kurtz. They wanted students to be able to use computers for more than just science and math, since at that time each computer used very custom assembly software that was so complex that just scientists and mathematicians learned to use it. BASIC became so popular that it became the default programming language for all home computer systems in the 1970s. Two students, Bill Gates and Paul Allen, met at Washington State University. They, like most students, wanted to earn some money, so they created a compact BASIC interpreter. They quickly figured out that if you wanted to sell something at any kind of scale, you need to do it as a company. So they founded Microsoft and released Microsoft BASIC in 1975. This version of BASIC proved hugely popular. Soon, nearly every home computer was running a version of it, often rebranded by the hardware vendor, like Atari BASIC and IBM BASIC. However, the sudden increase in computing power and the hunger for the public to have a computer at home meant innovation soon followed, and BASIC was left feeling, well, a bit basic. In the 1980s, Microsoft created DOS, the disk-based operating system, and that was widely used at home by all IBM-made machines. Microsoft also started working on a GUI for DOS in 1981. Windows at home. Soon after starting DOS and the GUI for DOS project, Bill Gates saw that Apple and Xerox were creating a much more user-friendly operating system for the then new Apple Macintosh. This low-cost Apple PC was so popular that everyone wanted to have a similar OS that they could sell with their hardware. Microsoft stepped up and released Windows 1.0 in 1985. By 1987, they added support for IBM computers. Windows 1.0 was essentially a graphical interface for DOS. Initial reviews were mixed, and many people felt that Windows 1.0 did not really meet or exceed the standard that Apple had set. Performance was a huge issue on this early operating system. Commercially, Windows 1.0 was not a big success. They soon followed up with Windows 2.0 and shortly thereafter Windows 2.1. Windows 2.1 proved to be an interesting operating system as it released in two editions, one for each type of Intel processor. There was Windows for 286 and Windows for 386. Windows 2.1 for 386 was very powerful and complex, especially compared to the older Windows 1.0 and even Windows 2. It added kernel protected modes and was widely loved at the time. The OS still ran on top of DOS, and all games at the time were written to run on DOS directly. In 1990, Microsoft released Windows 3.0. It was still a graphical operating system for the core DOS operating system. It was the first Windows to really excel commercially and critically. People now started comparing Apple Macintosh and Unix to Windows. It had much better memory management than any other Windows OS before, and multitasking was greatly improved. They released Windows 3.0 with multimedia extensions to the third-party manufacturers in 1991, and this added support for a wide array of devices like joysticks, graphics cards, and sound cards. In 1992, Microsoft released Windows 3.1, and it was their first 16-bit operating system. It added a TrueType font system, making it the first Windows operating system that can be used for desktop publishing. They later also patched Adobe Type Manager into Windows 3.1 to offer similar functionality for that operating system. Windows 3.1 was fully compatible with all older Windows platforms, and it was still running on top of DOS. Windows 3.1 had a host of upgrades versus Windows 3.0, like more memory support, and they even added the now classic Windows registry. In 1993, they released Windows for Workgroups. This meant that you could network and file share easier than ever before. At the same time, they were preparing to launch a brand new type of Windows, Windows 95. As the name states, it was released in 1995, and it was a huge upgrade over Windows 3.1, while still maintaining full compatibility with Windows 3.1 applications and hardware. It was the first Windows to support 16 and 32-bit applications for home users. It also added a new thing called plug and play. For the first time, consumers could, in theory, if their hardware window worked with Microsoft, plug different hardware into the machine and it would automatically install and configure the needed drivers. Windows 95 also unleashed Internet Explorer on the world. Windows 95 was a massive commercial success, and the follow-up release called Windows 98 built upon that. Windows 98 was the first OS from Microsoft to use the new Windows Driver Model, or WMD. This was not widely known at the time by hardware vendors, and it would take a few years for WMD to become widely adopted. Windows 98 was followed by Windows 98 SE that was essentially a very large service pack update. It contained many bug fixes, added support for much more hardware, and upgraded IE4 to IE5. And that was followed by Windows ME in 2000. The Millennium Edition was supposed to be a bridge between home and office users, but due to bugs and glitches, it was dead on arrival as far as critics were concerned. I mention home and office users because at this time Microsoft was playing in two fields, home users and office users. While it would take them a few years to merge these two groups as far as the operating systems go, let's jump into Windows at the office in the next video. Windows at the office. Let's discuss the branch of Windows operating systems aimed at the business and professional world. We are sticking to desktop operating systems for now. We will chat about servers in a later video. Windows 3.1 was released in 1993. Unlike Windows 3.1 that was a 16-bit operating system, Windows NT 3.1 was a 32-bit operating system. Microsoft called this new technology, or NT. The desktop user interface was very familiar to home users as it pretty much mirrored Windows 3.1. Windows NT was designed with three goals: portability, reliability, and personality. Portability, meaning it could run on more types of hardware. Reliability, Windows NT was designed not to crash or kernel panic like previous operating systems. The core of this OS was protected from direct access by other applications, and it was based on a microkernel. And personality, it should be able to run a wide array of applications that might have been written for other older operating systems. It was also designed with networking in mind. At this time, Novell NetWare was the king of the network operating systems, but Microsoft wanted a slice of that pie. It would take many years for them to get there, but this was the start. Windows NT 3.1 was also the first operating system to use the NTFS file system. Windows NT 3.5.1 was released a year later, and it had support for PowerPC hardware. It was also the last Windows NT version with support for 386 processors. Windows NT 3.5.1 also had full support for Windows 95 applications. Windows NT 4 was released in mid-1996, barely a year after Windows 3.5.1. It was Microsoft's primary business operating system until the introduction of Windows 2000. Windows Server, Workstation, and embedded editions were sold. All editions used a graphical user interface similar to that of Windows 95. It was also a fully 32-bit OS supporting a wide array of CPUs, and it was the last OS to support PowerPC. It was hugely popular and was supported for many years with 7 large service packs. It was not replaced by Microsoft until 2000 with Windows 2000. Windows 2000 was released in 2000. 4 editions was released: Professional, Server, Advanced Server, and Data Center Server. It was a huge upgrade in relation to Windows 4.0, and it added an updated file system called NTFS3 that supported disk quotas, encryption, and many other important updates. Windows 2000 Professional was aimed at business end users that supported up to 4 gigs of RAM. This was a lot at the time, and had a huge amount of upgradability for applications and components built in. At this point in early 2000, the business and home world started to merge with the popularity of laptops and notebooks, meaning that people could take work home and travel with their operating systems. So Microsoft wanted to create an operating system that had less barriers between private use and work use. Windows for Professionals. Windows XP was released in 2001. It was the love child of Windows ME and Windows 2000, merging home use and office work into one operating system. Microsoft initially released it in two versions, Home and Professional. It is widely considered to be one of the most beloved operating systems ever released by Microsoft, and support for it only ended in 2019. It brought many huge improvements to the end user, like a redesigned interface, networking, internet functionality, and the ability to roll back drivers. It also introduced Windows product activation. For the first time, Windows had to be activated via the internet or a telephone hotline. Failure to do so locked the OS down to very basic functions. Each user had 30 days from installation to activate their copies of Windows XP. Activation was done on a unique hardware ID that was generated, and any large changes to this hardware of your PC meant that you had to reactivate it. Windows XP would become the default operating system for most home and office users for the next few years. Windows Vista was released in 2007. Microsoft's primarily stated objective of Windows Vista was to improve the security of the Windows operating system. One common criticism of Windows XP and its predecessors was they commonly exploited security vulnerabilities and overall susceptibility to malware, viruses, and buffer overflows. To achieve this, the system core was made more secure and user access control was introduced. People hated this. It was slower to boot, slower to use, and UAC just kept getting in the way. Simply put, Windows XP users were not ready for this type of restrictions in 2007. Despite this, it sold fairly well and was eventually one of the most used operating systems on the internet after Windows XP. Most companies, however, never rolled out this Vista to the business world. Just 2 years after Windows Vista was released, Microsoft released Windows 7 in 2009. It is still part of the NT family, but could easily double as a home or office PC. Windows 7 ran on a hybrid kernel. It is one of the most widely sold and used operating systems in history, and even though it was essentially just a refined version of Windows Vista, it was much loved by end users. Windows 7 was available in 6 different editions, of which Home Premium, Professional, and Ultimate was available at retail in most countries. Ironically, the changes to the user access control on Windows 7 were criticized for being potentially insecure, but nearly everyone loved the OS so much that they ignored this. And today, 11 years later, it is still one of the most used operating systems in the world. In 2012, Microsoft released Windows 8. It was about as much loved as ME was. It was designed to run across desktop, tablets, and even mobile devices. The problem was it was terrible to use for mouse and keyboard users, and they just happened to be the vast majority of the Windows client base. In an attempt to be more like the devices people now spend all their time on, like tablets and phones, they shipped it also with an app store. It had USB 3 support right out of the box, and it made several big upgrades to security. But due to the terrible user interface, it was not widely adopted and most people ignored it. Microsoft went back to the drawing board, and just 1 year later, in 2013, they released Windows 8.1. This was a free upgrade to all Windows 8.0 users. With Windows 8.1, Microsoft addressed many of the concerns and issues people had with Windows 8. The Start menu, App Store, and OneDrive integration was vastly improved. It features a desktop mode for improved experience with mouse and keyboards. End user adoption rates were 3 times higher on Windows 8.1 than Windows 8.0, but it was nowhere near as popular as Windows 7. Even Gartner urged enterprises to avoid Windows 8 and 8.1 and just stick to Windows 7 until something better comes along. It took 2 years, but in 2015, Microsoft rolled out Windows 10. Windows 10 is available in 5 main editions for personal computing devices, of which Home and Pro versions are the most sold in retail. At release, people at home could upgrade from Windows 8.1 or Windows 7 to Windows 10 for free. This upgrade offer was extended for a full year and only expired in July of 2016. Windows 10 marked a massive shift in how Windows operating systems was to be delivered and supported for home users. Like Apple, you would now get free upgrades to the operating system for free. Unlike Apple Mac OS, however, these releases did not have specific names, but rather just version numbers. Version 1901 was released in November 2019. It is the 9th stable version upgrade to Windows 10. Windows 10 can be described as a living OS that is constantly being updated with new features and design changes. Updates are pushed to the end user via the Windows Update service. Windows Server updates are pushed via the WSUS for Enterprise service. And the Windows Store, which is now the rebranded App Store, can also push updates for apps installed by the store. The kernel is still based on Windows NT and it is still a hybrid kernel. Windows 10 also supports native Linux interactions via the Windows subsystem for Linux. Windows 10 is a massive topic, and I urge you to use the resources on LinkedIn Learning to explore more. Windows servers. In this video, we will briefly cover the history of Windows servers. In MST, or Microsoft Server Technologies, the course after OFS, you will get to know the more modern versions of Windows servers very well. But to know why things are the way they are, one has to go back to the start. Technically, the first Windows Server edition to be called Windows Server was Windows Server 2003, but that was not the beginning for Windows servers. To get to the beginning, we need to head back all the way to 1993 and Windows NT 3.1. Windows NT 3.1 released in 2 editions, Windows NT 3.1 for workstations and Windows NT 3.1 Advanced Server for servers. This server edition is what evolved into the family of Windows servers we know today. Windows NT Server 3.5 was released in 1994. This allowed the interconnectivity with Unix systems and Novell NetWare. At the time, Windows Server was the newcomer in the marketplace, and most networks ran on Unix or Novell servers. So compatibility with these two systems was essential if Windows Server was ever going to be adopted by the business world. Windows NT Server 3.5.1 was released in 1995. It shipped with a vastly improved interface similar to Windows 95. This server was also capable of managing computers running Windows 95. The server system gained the capability to manage software licenses for client computers and also to install and update Windows 95 machines on the same network. Windows NT Server 4.0 launched in 1996, and this had the full Windows 95 look and feel. It also shipped with IIS 2.0 for free. Internet Information Server, IIS, is Microsoft's web server system, which today is the leading web server software in the world, with Apache HTTP server as a close rival. IIS only overtook Apache as the most widely used web server in 2018. So it took Microsoft 22 years of handing it out for free to knock Apache off the top spot. The increased complexity of networks was reflected in the enhancements made to Windows NT Server 4 through service packs and the creation of a Windows NT Server Enterprise Edition in 1997. These improvements included the integration of public key encryption services and operating system management for server clusters. 2 other editions that took account of interactions with possibly congested networks were Transaction Server and Message Queue Server. The last enhancement to Windows NT 4 Server came with Windows NT 4 Server Terminal Server Edition in 1998. This improved connectivity to non-Windows systems and also created a bridge from 16-bit DOS applications so that they could interface with 32-bit desktop applications. Microsoft dropped the NT branding in the year 2000 with the release of Windows Server 2000. From then on, the version names of Windows servers came from the year of release. Windows Server 2000 came with enhancements that gave the operating system many features that we still use today. These include, but are not limited to, XML support, the creation of active server pages, and the use of Active Directory for user authentication. The Windows Server 2000 operating system also introduced the concept of tailored versions, with the release of a standard Windows Server, an advanced Windows Server, and a data center server. Windows Server 2003 was a complete rewrite, and it was released in 2003. Windows Server 2003 had the aimed objective to reduce events that required system reboots. It was now possible to install patches and updates on the fly without having to reboot the system. The company also enhanced the security features of the operating system, and this was the very first time that they shipped the .NET environment with Windows Server. The 2003 version of Windows included the concept of server roles, enabling the operating system to be tailored to specific specialized tasks, such as having a DNS server dedicated to DNS. As well as the standard, advanced, and data center versions, Microsoft also produced Windows Server 2003 Web Edition. A short while after the release of Windows Server 2003, Microsoft produced an update which converted the entire system to a 64-bit programming environment. Windows Server 2003 R2 came out in 2005. Customers who have already bought Windows Server 2003 were allowed to freely upgrade to this version. Improvements to the server system that appeared with R2 focused on security. User authentication was now fully based on Active Directory. However, Microsoft developed an extra feature for this authentication system, and this was also bundled into R2. This new feature was called the Active Directory Federation Services. The purpose of this AD extension was to enable external services to be included in a single sign-on permission managed system that was managed from within the network. The R2 package also made it possible to get security policies for groups of machines through Security Configuration Wizard. Other R2 improvements included better data compression for files and the transfer and replication of procedures across multi-site WANs. The next version of Windows Server took 3 years to get ready, and it included another big enhancement to Active Directory. The company also made some fundamental changes on how network services interacted with the software support feature of the operating system. A big gain and update for Windows Server users at this point was the inclusion of Microsoft's new Hyper-V virtualization system. Other new utilities bundled into Windows Server 2008 was the Event Viewer and the Server Manager. These were useful system administration tools that enabled administrators to get better control over activities on the server. Server Core was an increasingly important product for Microsoft. It was a bare bones version of Windows Server that allowed only command line access. It can be run without the familiar GUI desktop of Windows. And it appealed to system administrators that were used to more traditional servers setups that can be found in Unix and Linux. There are 4 editions of Windows Server 2008, namely Standard, Enterprise, Data Center, and Web. Windows Server 2008 R2 was made available in 2009, and it is still in use today. Most of the changes that distinguished this from the original Windows 2008 were technical and occurred in the underlying support services. R2 was based on Windows 7, making it a native 64-bit environment. This version of Windows Server saw some changes in Active Directory to improve group policy implementation, and new services were added. Some of these services included stuff like remote desktop services, which was a repackaging of the terminal services. Branch cache and direct access also appeared in this version of Windows Server to improve access to the server from users on remote locations. By 2012, Microsoft released Windows Server 2012, and the focus was the cloud. So they added features to Windows Server to better enable interaction with offsite services. The company marketed Windows Server 2012 as the Cloud OS. All the improvements to the Windows Server system in this version focused on getting integrated Hyper-V into shape and to make cloud resources as easy to integrate into on-site delivery as localhost was. The storage system mediated by Hyper-V was also updated in this version. The Hyper-V Virtual Switch and Hyper-V Replica was included in this release to enhance the uptake of hybrid network strategies. Both PowerShell and Server Core grew in importance with this release. There are 4 editions of Windows Server 2012: Essential, Foundation, Standard, and Data Center. The Essentials edition is aimed at small businesses. Windows Server 2012 R2 was released in 2013. The composition of the operating system now saw the use of PowerShell extended even further. Microsoft continued its aim to produce better server functions on-site that provided the capability to integrate with cloud services. This involved rewriting security systems and network services. Virtualization and storage systems were also overhauled, and web services were greatly enhanced. The storage features that was enhanced in this upgrade included replication for distributed files and improved access for file sharing. Windows Server 2016 was released in, spoiler, 2016. It was bundled with a very important new feature. It was called a nano server, a lightweight, minimal server implementation that had fewer interfaces and it was much harder to attack. This version of Windows Server also included the server core. VM services and systems was also added to the encryption system for Hyper-V, and they are now added the capability and ability to interact with Docker. This tool was particularly useful for containerization, which enabled system administrators to deliver corporate-owned software to end-user-owned devices. Microsoft introduced a network controller in Windows Server 2016. This facility enabled administrators to manage both physical and virtual network devices from a single console. Windows Server 2016 was available in Standard and Data Center editions. There was no R2 version for Windows Server 2016. Finally, we get to Windows Server 2019. Now you will probably get to know this very well in MST, so we will just be covering like a brief overview of what they added in Windows Server 2019. Windows Server 2019 was released in 2018 and is the latest server operating system available from Microsoft at this time. They added a new feature called the Windows Admin Center. This is a server management utility that's not only designed for Windows Server 2009, but can also manage servers operating still on Windows Server 2012 R2 and Windows Server 2016. The console covers multiple servers, and it doesn't matter whether the operating system of the monitored server is the full GUI version, the server core version, or even the nano server version. The utility includes performance monitoring, configuration management, and the control of services that run on each monitored server. As you can deduct from the previous videos, Microsoft had a strong push into virtualization and cloud services. This 10-year-long campaign can now be mirrored by the advances in Microsoft's cloud services. So with the latest roll-up of all the recent VM development over the past years, they released a package called HCI, or Hyper-Converged Infrastructure. The HCI features of the latest Windows Server is aimed more at service consumers rather than providers. However, the system is capable of supporting software-defined data centers to providers and consumers. The HCI capabilities offer the ability to adjust virtualized services without taking the system down. Many of the adjustments to resources supporting VMs can even be executed automatically. So, for instance, if a rule exists to increase the disk space dynamically for a server as it gets fuller, it will do that without taking down the server. Or if more memory is needed, more memory will be added to the pool if the rule is set up for that, without the need of having to reboot that server. It's also now possible to run Linux on a Windows server by using the new Linux-compatible subsystem. Microsoft calls this the native shielded VMs for Linux, and this is built into Hyper-V. The latest security threat to IT systems is known as advanced persistent threats. These APT attacks are able to bypass traditional antivirus systems because their entry points are often facilitated by whaling, spear phishing, and social media profiling. You will learn much more about this in IIS at the end of your first year. As traditional defense tactics block access are no longer sufficient to protect systems and data, advanced threat protection services are needed. So Microsoft included Windows Defender ATP in Windows Server 2019. The ATP monitors account activities, protects log files from unauthorized changes, and keeps track of activities of users around data storage to be able to early detect and stop APT intrusions. The server core option is still built into Windows Server 2019, and it's now even leaner, representing only 50% the size of a full GUI-led Windows Server 2019. This slimming down also applies to the delivery of containerization on software when it is delivered to user-owned devices. The lowering of the overhead created by the containerization mechanism has not been made at the expense of any security. There is a ton more features included in Windows Server 2019. But for now, we can sign off on it and move on to the next video, as you will learn a lot more about this in MST.